I finally told my best friend the truth, and the universe decided that was the perfect time to get hit by a car. I was staring out my window at the moving truck parked outside my best friend B's building when my phone buzzed with a text from her. "I'm leaving today. You could still stop me. Tell me to stay." My chest tightened. How could I? She knew I'd been in love with her for years, but when she started dating my friend Nick, I backed up, gave them space, tried to move on, and I almost did until last night when she showed up to my apartment crying, telling me that being with Nick made her realize she wasn't in love with him at all, that she actually loved me and thought about me the whole time. But when B asked if I wanted to give us a chance, I felt betrayed, like I was a backup plan. So I told her I didn't feel that way about her anymore and she needed to move on. I watched the hope in her eyes die right there in my doorway. Now she was leaving. For good, a fresh start away from me. I watched her carry boxes down the stairs when our eyes met. She stared at me for a while, waiting for me to stop her, to tell her to stay, just like she asked for in the texts. When I stayed silent, she just nodded, got in her car, and started driving away. But the second her taillights disappeared around the corner, the panic hit me. I ran back upstairs and grabbed my phone. My hands shook so bad I could barely unlock it. I called Nick. "I know you don't want to hear from me, but B's leaving. And I wanted to feel okay with this, but I'm not." Nick answered immediately. "So go after her." "I can't. You and her were—" "Dude, she was never in love with me," Nick interrupted. "The entire time we were together, she'd light up whenever you texted. I'd be mid-sentence telling her about work, and she's listen. But the moment your name popped up on her phone screen, her entire face softened in a way it never did with me." He sighed. The words hit me hard. "But she dated you. She chose you," I argued, feeling like I was losing my mind. "Only because she didn't know. You know, before she left, we had an honest talk, and she told me how she felt like she spent 3 months trying to convince herself she loved me. But every time something good or bad happened, I wasn't the person she wanted to tell. You were." She cried, saying that loving the wrong person was the loneliest feeling in the world. I couldn't breathe. All this time I thought she'd chosen him over me, that I'd loved her while she wanted someone else. But she'd been falling in love with me the whole time and didn't even realize it until now, when it was too late. "She didn't come back to you because I wasn't enough," Nick continued. "She came back because she finally understood what she'd been feeling all those years. You're not her backup plan. You're the person she's been in love, and I know you're still in love with her." I stood up. "I'm going after her," I announced before hanging up. I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, dialing her number as I took the stairs 2 steps at a time. I hopped into the car and zoomed through the highway, trying to catch her before her flight. She didn't pick up. I tried calling again, same thing. On the 3rd call, I poured my heart out into the voicemail, hoping that maybe it'd reach her. "B, it's me. Don't hang up. Please just listen. I was hurt. I thought I was your second choice, that you settled for me because it didn't work out with him. I didn't even give you a chance to explain." I paused, swerving from lane to lane as I got closer to the exit, just 10 minutes away from finally pulling her into my arms. "Nick told me the truth," I continued. "And you know what? You mean everything to me. And I don't think I could spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have been. So please wait for me. Let me find you and tell you just how much I want to be with you. And how much I love." A large truck hit me dead on at an intersection. My car flipped 4 times before hitting one of the light posts. I was 3 minutes from the airport. When I opened my eyes, everything was white. A nurse walked in smiling when her eyes went wide. "Oh my God, you're awake," she gasped out before running away. Over the next hour, an old woman walked into the room, her smile soft and friendly, but her eyes filled with sadness. When she got closer, my breath nearly stopped. It was her. It was B. But she wasn't 21 anymore. Her hair had threads of silver, fine lines around her eyes. "It's been 15 years, she whispered. "Is it too late?" I asked her. She looked me in the eyes. She took a shaky breath and pulled a chair closer to my bed. Her hand reached out slow and careful, like she was scared I might break if she moved too fast. Her fingers wrapped around mine and they felt warm and real, and nothing like the memory I'd been holding on to for what felt like yesterday, but was actually 15 years. "It's not too late for us to know each other again," she said quietly. "But everything changed. We both changed. We need to take this really slow." Before I could figure out what to say back, the door opened and a doctor in a white coat walked in carrying a tablet. He stopped when he saw I was awake and talking, then moved to the other side of my bed. He introduced himself, but the name slipped right out of my head because he started explaining what happened to me, and I couldn't focus on anything else. Severe head trauma from the car accident, 15 years in a coma. My brain had been healing itself this whole time, building new paths around the damaged parts. He talked about physical therapy and cognitive tests, and relearning basic stuff like walking and getting dressed. My body forgot how to do almost everything while I was asleep. The road ahead would take months, maybe years. He kept going, but I stopped hearing the words because the weight of it all pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. B squeezed my hand and I looked at her again. She waited until the doctor left before she spoke. "I'll be here to support you through this," she said. But I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person who begged you to stop me from leaving. I have a career now, responsibilities, a whole life I built without you that I can't just drop. Her voice cracked a little on the last part. I want to help you, but I also need to take care of myself. Does that make sense? I nodded, even though part of me wanted to scream that none of this made sense. My voice came out rough when I finally managed to talk. The voicemail. The one I was leaving when the truck hit me. Did you hear it? She pulled her phone out of her pocket and held it up. I kept it all these years, she said. But hearing it might be harder than you expect right now. Are you sure you want to? I wasn't sure about anything anymore, but I nodded anyway. A woman with dark hair and a thick folder walked in before B could play the voicemail. She introduced herself as Olivia Caruso and explained she was here to help me figure out all the legal and financial stuff. She sat down in another chair and opened the folder on her lap. My parents had guardianship over me for the first 7 years. Then they both died in a car accident 8 years ago, and guardianship transferred to my sister, who moved across the country with her family. Olivia said she'd help me apply for disability benefits and deal with insurance claims, and eventually get back my legal right to make my own decisions once I was stable enough. The words felt like they were coming from far away. My parents were dead. My sister was gone. Everything I knew was just gone. I looked at B and forced myself to ask the question that had been sitting in my throat since I woke up. What about Nick? Are you two still together? She shook her head and something in her face softened. We broke up within a year, she said. I couldn't stop comparing him to what I felt for you. Every time we went somewhere or did something, I'd think about how you would have reacted or what joke you would have made. It wasn't fair to him. We talked about it and decided we were better as friends. He's doing really well now, has his own life. He'll probably want to visit you once you're up for it. The relief that hit me felt wrong and selfish, but I couldn't help it. The tears came before I could stop them. They ran down my face and into my ears because I couldn't lift my hands to wipe them away. I'm sorry, I said, and my voice broke completely. I'm so sorry for turning you away at my door that night, for being too proud and hurt to just listen to you, for letting all of this happen because I was stupid and scared. B started crying too, and she leaned forward, her forehead almost touching the bed rail. I forgive you, she said. I forgave you a long time ago, but forgiveness doesn't erase 15 years. It doesn't make us the same people we were back then. We can't just pick up where we left off like nothing happened. She was right, and I knew it, but that didn't make it hurt any less. A man walked in later that afternoon and introduced himself as Will Hancock. He was my physical therapist, and he needed to do an evaluation to see what my body could still do. He moved my arms and legs gently, testing how my muscles responded. Everything felt weak and wrong, like my body belonged to someone else. He explained that 15 years in bed meant my muscles had wasted away and my bones had gotten thin. My body literally forgot how to do almost everything. He set small goals for me. Lift my arm 6 inches off the bed. Flex my toes. Turn my head to the side. Things that used to be automatic now took all my focus and strength. He said it would take months of painful work just to sit up on my own. Maybe a year before I could walk again. The numbers felt impossible. That night after everyone left, I stared at the ceiling and tried to count everything I missed. 21 birthdays turned into 36. Spring, summer, fall, winter, over and over 15 times without me. My parents growing old and then dying without me there. My sister building a family I'd never met. Friends moving on, getting married, having kids, living entire lives while I was frozen in this bed. The grief felt too big for my body. It pushed against my ribs and made my chest tight, and I couldn't cry anymore because I was too tired and too empty and too scared of what came next. B came back the next morning carrying a cardboard box. She set it on the chair and started pulling things out. Photos of her sitting next to my bed during different seasons. Her hair short, then long, then short again. Cards she'd written to me on my birthdays and holidays. A journal where she'd written about her visits and what was happening in her life. I looked through the photos slowly, seeing versions of her I never got to meet. Her at 25 with a new haircut. Her at 30 looking tired but stronger somehow. Her at 35 with those silver threads in her hair that I noticed when she first walked in. She'd been here the whole time, living and changing and growing older while I stayed frozen at 21. The box was proof that she never forgot me, even when maybe she should have. B put the photos back in the box and sat down next to my bed again. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. I wanted to ask about the 15 years, but I didn't know where to start. She seemed to read my mind because she took a breath and started talking. She told me she moved to another city about 6 months after the accident, took a job opportunity that got her away from everything that reminded her of me. She met someone at work, a guy who was nice and stable and made her feel less alone. They dated for a year and got married in a small ceremony with just a few friends. No big wedding, nothing fancy. She said it felt right at the time, like she was finally moving forward instead of being stuck in the past. But 3 years in, they both woke up one day and realized they'd rushed into everything because they were trying to fix something broken inside themselves. The divorce was quiet and sad, but not angry. There were no kids, which she said she was grateful for now because it would have made everything so much more complicated. She looked at me when she finished, and I could see she was waiting for me to react. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt relieved that she wasn't with him anymore, which made me feel like a terrible person. The other part just felt sad that she'd lived this whole life, made these huge decisions, built and lost a marriage, all while I was lying here frozen in time. Before I could figure out what to say, someone knocked on the door. Olivia walked in carrying another folder, and she looked between me and B like she was interrupting something important. B stood up and said she'd come back tomorrow, gave my hand a quick squeeze, and left. Olivia pulled up the chair and opened her folder. It was day 4 since I woke up, and she needed to go over the realistic timeline for my recovery. She spread papers across the table next to my bed and started explaining. I'd need at least 3 months of intensive inpatient rehab before anyone could even discuss transitioning to outpatient care. She said it slowly, making sure I understood. This wasn't going to be a quick recovery. I couldn't just work hard for a few weeks and go home. My body had been in bed for 15 years, and that meant my muscles, bones, organs, everything had changed. She needed me to understand that my expectations had to match medical reality, or I'd end up frustrated and giving up. I nodded, but inside I was panicking. 3 months minimum just to get to the next stage. How long until I could walk? Live alone? Have any kind of normal life? Olivia must have seen it on my face because she said we'd take it one day at a time and celebrate small victories. She left after making me sign some forms about the rehab transfer. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about B's marriage and divorce, about 3 months of rehab, about how much time had already been lost, and how much more would slip away. When B came back the next morning, I'd worked up the courage to ask her something that had been burning in my chest since she first walked in. I asked if we could try to be together now. My heart was racing and my hands felt sweaty against the hospital sheets. She closed her eyes, and I watched her face go through about 10 different emotions in 5 seconds. When she opened them again, she looked sad and honest. She said she didn't know what she wanted yet. She said right now my only job was to focus on getting stronger and learning to live in this new world. Everything else could wait. I felt something break inside me when she said that. I'd woken up from 15 years, and she was the first person I saw, and I thought maybe that meant something. But she was right. I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to even sit up on my own. What kind of relationship could we have like this? I snapped at her before I could stop myself. I told her she was the reason I was here in the first place. That I crashed because I was chasing her to the airport, because I was leaving that voicemail telling her I loved her. The words came out sharp and mean, and I hated myself the second they left my mouth. Bee stood up and grabbed her bag. Her face went pale and I could see tears starting. I apologized immediately, desperately. I said I didn't mean it, that I was scared and confused and taking it out on her. She stopped at the door and turned around. She said we could keep talking, but we needed to do it without putting labels or pressure on whatever this was between us. She said she'd come back tomorrow, but I needed to understand that blaming her for my choices wasn't fair to either of us. She left, and I spent the rest of the day feeling like garbage. A week passed with short, careful visits from B. We talked about safe things like the weather and what shows were popular now and how much technology had changed. It felt fake and distant, but I didn't know how to fix it after what I'd said. Then one afternoon she came in and suggested something that made my stomach drop. She said maybe we should listen to the voicemail together. Just the first 30 seconds. She thought it might help us both understand what happened that day, instead of letting it sit between us like this huge, unspoken thing. I agreed, even though I was terrified. She pulled out her phone and came to sit right next to my bed. She pressed play, and I heard my own voice, younger and full of panic. I heard myself say her name, heard the desperation and love in my tone. It was like listening to a stranger and myself at the same time. We got to 30 seconds, and she stopped it. We both had tears running down our faces. Neither of us could speak for a while. Finally, I said maybe we should wait before hearing the rest. She nodded and put her phone away. Something had broken open between us, but in a different way than before. It felt raw, but also honest. A few days later, B told me she'd started seeing a therapist named Jasmine. She said she needed help working through the complicated mix of guilt and relief she felt about my accident and recovery. I asked what she meant by relief, and she said she'd explain more later, but basically she was glad I was awake even though the circumstances were awful. Over the next few weeks, she mentioned Jasmine more and more. Apparently Jasmine was helping her recognize patterns in her life, like how she always tried to fix things and people instead of dealing with her own stuff. B said Jasmine told her she needed to learn when to step back and let others take responsibility for their own healing. I didn't know what to think about that. Part of me wanted her to keep coming every day, to be there for everything. But another part knew she was probably right. One morning I asked Olivia to help me call Nick. My hands shook as she dialed the number. I was so nervous about hearing his voice after 15 years. What if he hated me? What if he blamed me for everything? He answered on the second ring and his voice was warm and familiar. He said he was glad I was awake, that he'd visit soon, that B never stopped caring about me even when she tried to move on. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, and when we hung up I felt lighter than I had since waking up. Nick was okay. He had his own life now and he didn't sound angry or hurt. He just sounded like my friend. B came in that afternoon and told me she'd negotiated with her boss to work partially remote. She'd visit me 3 times a week, but not more than that. She said she was determined not to let my recovery consume her entire life the way she knew she would have done when she was younger. I wanted to argue, but I understood. She had a job, friends, a whole life that existed before I woke up. She couldn't just drop everything. 3 weeks into rehab, Will showed up with a walker. He said it was time to try standing. I was excited and terrified at the same time. He positioned the walker and helped me shift my weight. My legs shook so hard I thought they'd collapse under me. Everything burned and felt weak and wrong. But I held myself upright for almost a full minute before Will helped me back down. Everyone in the rehab room clapped. The accomplishment felt both massive and heartbreakingly small compared to what I used to be able to do. I used to run, play basketball, take stairs 2 at a time. Now standing for 60 seconds was a victory worth celebrating. That night, B called me instead of visiting. She said she'd had a breakthrough session with Jasmine. She realized her marriage had failed partly because she chose someone who needed rescuing rather than someone who was already whole. She said she was terrified of repeating that pattern with me. She needed to figure out how to support me without making my recovery her entire identity. I listened and tried not to feel hurt. She wasn't saying she didn't care. She was saying she cared, so much that she needed to do this the right way. We talked for an hour about boundaries and expectations and what healthy support actually looked like. It wasn't the romantic conversation I'd imagined having with her, but maybe it was more important. The next morning, Olivia came back with a folder so thick it barely fit under her arm. She pulled the bedside table closer and spread papers across every inch of it. Forms for disability benefits, medical bills with numbers that made my stomach hurt, a life insurance policy my parents had set up years ago that would help but wouldn't cover everything. She walked me through each document slowly, pointing at lines and explaining what they meant. The medical debt had been building up for 15 years. The insurance covered most of it, but there were gaps and co-pays and things nobody expected. My parents had paid what they could before they died. After that, my sister took over, but she had her own family and her own bills. Olivia said we'd figure out a payment plan once we knew what I could actually do long-term. Maybe I could work someday. Maybe I'd need ongoing care. Too early to know for sure. She promised to help me build a realistic financial plan, but right now it was just about understanding where things stood. I signed forms until my hand cramped. Each signature felt like accepting a future I hadn't chosen. A few days later, B showed up carrying a small box. She set it on my lap and opened the top. My old phone sat inside, plugged into a charger that looked ancient compared to the sleek one she pulled from her pocket. She'd found it in the storage unit where my sister kept my stuff. Underneath the phone were printouts, pages and pages of them. Group chat conversations from over the years. Our friend group talking about me like I was already gone. I read through messages about Jake's wedding and Annalyn's new baby and Chris moving to Seattle. They mentioned me sometimes, remembered stories, wondered if I'd ever wake up. It was strange seeing myself discussed like a memory, like someone who used to exist but didn't anymore. One message from 3 years ago made me stop. Annalyn had written about visiting me on my birthday, and how weird it felt talking to someone who couldn't respond. Jake replied, saying he couldn't do hospital visits anymore because it hurt too much. They all agreed they'd never forget me, but they had to keep living. I understood that. I did. But reading it still felt like watching my own funeral. That night, B and I made a decision. We'd listen to the whole voicemail together. No more stopping after 30 seconds. She pulled out her phone and we sat close on my hospital bed. She hit play. My younger voice poured out through the tiny speaker, desperate and scared and so completely in love it hurt to hear. I listened to myself explain about being hurt and feeling like a backup plan, about Nick telling me the truth, about not wanting to spend my life wondering what we could have been. My voice cracked when I said I loved her. Then came the sound I'd been dreading. The impact. Metal crushing, glass breaking, a scream that might have been mine. Then nothing. The voicemail cut off. We sat in heavy silence for a long time. B's hand found mine and squeezed. I finally broke the quiet. I told her I understood why I felt that way back then. The fear and the hurt and the desperate need to fix everything before it was too late. But I couldn't let that moment define everything now. We weren't those people anymore. That crash didn't get to decide our future. B shifted on the bed and looked at me directly. She said she needed to tell me something about her marriage. It ended because she kept avoiding the hard conversations. Whenever something felt broken between them, she'd find a project to focus on instead. Remodel the kitchen, plan an elaborate vacation, volunteer for extra work assignments, anything to keep from sitting down and facing what was actually wrong. Her ex eventually called her on it, said he felt like he was living with a roommate who managed problems instead of a partner who shared them. She tried to change, but the patterns were too deep. They separated after 5 years and divorced a year later. She looked at me when she finished and said this wasn't about me or our history. It was about patterns she needed to change in herself, about learning to stay present even when things got uncomfortable instead of always trying to fix everything. Week 5 arrived and so did Nick. A nurse helped me sit up straighter before he came in. When he walked through the door, I barely recognized him. Older, obviously. Beard, different glasses. but the same warm smile. We hugged carefully around my IV lines. Both of us cried a little. He pulled a chair close and sat down. He admitted something I'd wondered about for weeks. He said he always knew B looked at me differently. Even when they were together, he could see it. Her face would change when my name came up in conversation. When someone told a story about me, her whole expression softened in a way it never did with him. He said he tried not to mind because she was kind and present and really trying to love him. But you can't force that kind of connection. He knew it then, and he definitely knew it now, after years of thinking about it. After Nick left, B came back in. She told me she and Nick had talked privately in the hallway. They made an agreement. They wouldn't triangulate or put each other in the middle of whatever happened between her and me. No asking Nick to relay messages or check how I was feeling. No putting him in a position where he had to choose sides or manage our relationship. They wanted to protect their friendship. They'd worked too hard to rebuild it after their breakup, and they weren't going to mess it up by repeating old painful patterns. I nodded and said that made sense. Nick had been a good friend to both of us. He deserved better than being caught in the middle again. Week 6 brought a setback I should have seen coming. Will had me working with the walker in the therapy room. I was doing well, taking careful steps while he spotted me, but I got confident. Thought I could push further than he recommended. I convinced him to let me try walking to the far wall instead of just the halfway point. Halfway there, my legs started shaking. Will told me to stop and rest, but I kept going. 3 steps later, my legs gave out completely. I fell hard, hit the floor with my hip taking most of the impact. Everyone in the room rushed over. Will checked me carefully while I lay there feeling stupid and embarrassed. The bruising was bad. Bad enough that we had to stop physical therapy for a week while it healed. A whole week of progress lost because I couldn't listen to someone who actually knew what they were doing. B told me later that week about a conversation she had with Jasmine. Her therapist asked her to explore a scary possibility. Maybe she needed to step back from visiting so often. Maybe her constant presence was becoming an emotional crutch for both of us. B said she fought against the idea at first, got defensive, said she was just being supportive. But Jasmine pushed back gently, asked if B was supporting my recovery or trying to be essential to it, asked if she was helping me build independence or making herself necessary. B admitted to me that the questions hit hard. She realized she'd been measuring her worth by how much I needed her. Jasmine told her my recovery couldn't be about earning her love or proving she was worth her sacrifice. It had to be about me learning to live again regardless of whether we ended up together. We had the hard conversation 2 days later. B sat in the chair beside my bed instead of on the bed with me. She said she wanted to be my friend first. Real friends. While I rebuilt basic life skills and independence. No pressure about romance or relationship timelines. Just 2 people learning to know each other again in this completely different context. I felt defensive immediately, wanted to argue that we were more than friends and always had been. But I stopped myself, forced myself to actually listen. She was right. I was still relearning how to shower without help, how to dress myself, how to make it through a full day without exhausting myself completely. I couldn't jump straight into a relationship when I was still figuring out how to be a functional adult. It hurt to hear, but I knew it was true. The next time B visited, she brought an envelope. Plain white, sealed. She handed it to me and said she'd written me a long letter. About who she was at 21 versus who she is now at 36. About the ways she'd grown and the ways she still struggled. She said I could read it whenever I was ready. No pressure, no timeline, just whenever it felt right. I held the envelope carefully and thanked her. After she left, I set it on the small table beside my bed. I wasn't ready yet. But knowing it was there, knowing she'd taken the time to write down everything she wanted me to understand, that meant something. It meant she was trying just as hard as I was to do this right, instead of just doing it fast. That night, I opened the envelope and pulled out 3 pages covered in B's handwriting. She wrote about dropping out of grad school at 23 because she couldn't focus on anything except wondering if I'd wake up. She described meeting her ex-husband at a hospital fundraiser 2 years later, how he seemed stable and kind and nothing like the chaos she felt inside. She admitted she married him partly because he never asked too much of her, never pushed past the walls she'd built. The pages detailed her promotion at work, the apartment she bought alone after the divorce, the therapy sessions where she learned she kept choosing people she could fix instead of people who challenged her to grow. She ended by saying she loved me, but didn't know if she loved the real me, or just the idea of finally getting the ending she'd imagined for 15 years. I read it twice and then set it down carefully. All this time I'd been focused on whether she still wanted me, whether we could make this work, whether I deserved another chance. But I hadn't thought about who I actually was beyond someone who loved B. The accident stole my chance to build a career, figure out what I cared about, become a whole person with interests and goals and a life that meant something. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and realized I had no idea what kind of person I wanted to be now. B showed up 2 days later instead of the next day like usual. She explained she'd be coming twice a week now instead of 3 times, that we both needed space to exist separately instead of orbiting each other constantly. My chest tightened with loneliness, but I forced myself to nod and say I understood. After she left, I noticed something shift during my afternoon therapy session with Will. I actually tried harder, pushed through the pain in my legs without thinking about saving energy to be present and engaged when B visited. Will noticed too and increased the resistance on the leg press machine, making me work muscles I'd been babying for weeks. The burn felt good in a way I hadn't expected. Like I was building something for myself instead of just performing recovery for someone else to witness. The next week, I sat down for lunch in the rehab cafeteria next to another patient who'd been eating alone every day. He was maybe 50 with a slight droop to the left side of his face from a stroke 6 months ago. I asked if the seat was taken and he shook his head, so I settled in with my tray. We ate in silence for a few minutes before he pointed at my walker and said his was the same model. I pointed at his left hand doing therapy exercises with a stress ball and said I had one of those too. We started eating together every day after that, comparing how many steps we could manage or complaining about how exhausting it was to relearn things our bodies used to do automatically. Having someone else to talk to besides medical staff, and B made me feel less like a patient and more like a regular person who just happened to be going through something hard. B told me during her next visit that she'd started attending a caregiver support group on Tuesday evenings. She described sitting in a circle with other people who loved someone going through recovery or chronic illness. One woman shared about her husband's addiction, how she'd spent years trying to save him by paying his debts and making excuses and basically doing everything except letting him face real consequences. The woman said she finally realized she wasn't helping him get better. She was just making it possible for him to stay sick while feeling like a hero for standing by him. B said the parallels hit her hard. She'd been measuring her worth by how much I needed her, making herself necessary to my recovery instead of helping me build actual independence. The woman at the group said the hardest thing was stepping back and trusting that the person you love can survive without you constantly rescuing them. Hannah McGill showed up the following week with a leather folder full of forms and a calm energy that made me feel like maybe this whole legal mess was actually manageable. She explained that restoring my capacity to make my own medical and financial decisions meant proving to a judge that I understood my situation and could advocate for myself. We spent 2 hours going through paperwork while she asked me questions about my treatment plan, my living situation, what I wanted for my future. I signed forms and initialed pages and felt something powerful shift inside me. For months, other people had been making decisions about my body and my life because legally I wasn't considered capable. Now I was taking that power back even though the system felt designed for people who had someone to guide them through every confusing step. Hannah promised to file everything by the end of the week and said we'd have a hearing date within a month. V sat on her apartment floor that same night surrounded by old notebooks and her laptop open to a music app. She scrolled through playlists she'd made over the years until she found one called Frozen in Time, from when she was 21. The songs were all from that year, stuff that had been playing in coffee shops and on car radios back when we were just figuring out who we were. She clicked through the tracks and remembered making it during the first year of my coma, back when she still thought I might wake up any day and we'd just pick up where we left off. She selected the whole playlist and hit delete, then told Jasmine about it during their next session. Letting go of that playlist felt like releasing a fantasy version of us that never really existed, she said. The people we were back then didn't know anything about building a real relationship. They just knew how to want each other from a safe distance. Will arranged a supervised outing to the intersection where the accident happened. He drove me there on a Wednesday morning with another staff member in the back seat just in case. We parked across the street and I stared at the corner where the light post used to be before they replaced it. My hands started shaking first. Then my breathing got tight and fast and I couldn't pull enough air into my lungs. The edges of my vision went fuzzy, and I heard Will's voice from very far away telling me to focus on his counting. I forced myself to breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, just like my therapist had taught me. I pressed my feet flat against the car floor and named 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear. The panic didn't disappear, but it stopped growing, stopped threatening to swallow me completely. After 10 minutes, I could breathe normally again, and Will asked if I wanted to leave. I shook my head and we sat there for another 20 minutes, while I just looked at that corner and let myself remember that it happened, that I survived, that I was still here. B met me at a park near the rehab facility that afternoon. She brought takeout from a Thai place, and we sat on a bench eating pad Thai straight from the containers without talking much. The silence felt comfortable instead of heavy. After a while, she mentioned she'd been driving a different route to avoid that intersection for 15 years, adding 10 minutes to her commute just so she wouldn't have to see the spot where everything changed. Maybe next time we could map out a new route together, she said. Not the old way and not her avoidance way, but something different that didn't carry so much weight. I told her that sounded good, and we went back to eating while watching people walk their dogs and kids play on the swings. I admitted to B the next time she visited that I'd put her on a pedestal for so long, made her into this perfect person in my mind who could do no wrong. Now I was trying to see her as someone real with flaws and complicated feelings and a whole life I didn't know anything about. She laughed, but it came out sad and tired. She said that was probably the most honest thing I'd said since waking up, that she'd felt me looking at her like she was some kind of saint for visiting all those years, when really she'd just been a person trying to figure out how to live with guilt and grief and love all tangled up together. We sat with that truth for a while, both of us recognizing that whatever we built now had to be based on who we actually were, instead of who we'd imagined each other to be. B confessed to Jasmine during her session that week that she was starting to feel attracted to me again, but it was different now. Less desperate and frantic, more steady and grounded. She described it as wanting to know me better instead of needing to save me or be saved by me. Jasmine asked if that scared her, and B admitted it did because she didn't trust her own judgment about relationships anymore. Every time she'd felt strongly about someone, it had been wrapped up in trying to fix them or avoid her own problems. But she also couldn't deny that something real was growing between us, something that felt less like the fantasy she'd been holding on to and more like two actual people learning to see each other clearly for the first time. I called Jasmine's office the next morning and asked if I could book a solo session before our next joint meeting with B. The receptionist scheduled me for 2 days later. When I arrived, Jasmine sat across from me with her notepad and asked what I wanted to work on. I told her I needed help figuring out how to talk to B about moving forward without making her feel responsible for my happiness, or like I was pressuring her into something she wasn't ready for. Jasmine nodded and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. She had me write down exactly what I wanted to say, then we went through it line by line, cutting out anything that sounded like I was asking B to fix me or save me. We practiced different scenarios where B might respond with hesitation or uncertainty, and Jasmine coached me on how to listen without getting defensive or trying to argue her into feeling differently. By the end of the hour, I had a script that felt honest but not desperate, clear but not demanding. Jasmine reminded me that whatever B decided, I needed to be working on building my own life separate from her. I left feeling nervous but more prepared than I'd felt about anything since waking up. The joint session happened 3 days later in Jasmine's office. B sat on one end of the couch and I sat on the other, both of us tense and careful. Jasmine asked us to talk about what dating might look like if we decided to try it. I went first, using the script I'd practiced, explaining that I wanted us to move slowly with regular check-ins about how we were both feeling. I said I couldn't promise anything about the future yet, and I needed to stay in individual therapy to keep working on myself. B looked surprised but relieved. She added that she needed the same things, plus both of us being honest if doubts or concerns came up. Jasmine wrote everything down on a whiteboard, and we spent the next 40 minutes outlining specific boundaries and expectations. It felt weirdly formal, like we were negotiating a business contract instead of talking about our feelings. But it also felt safer than just hoping we'd figure everything out as we went. When the session ended, we had a clear framework that felt manageable instead of overwhelming. Week 13 of physical therapy arrived, and Will had me try walking without the walker. I'd been using it less and less over the past few days, but this was the first time he wanted me to go completely unsupported. He stood close enough to catch me if I fell and told me to take it slow. I took one step, then another, my legs shaking with the effort of holding my full weight. 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps. The whole rehab staff had gathered to watch, and when I made it to 6 steps before needing to stop, they all started clapping and cheering. Will grinned and clapped me on the shoulder. It was a small victory compared to what most people could do without thinking, but it meant I was getting closer to being able to live on my own. That felt more important than any romantic outcome. I could take care of myself. I could build a life that worked even if B and I didn't work out. B texted me the next afternoon asking if I wanted to visit a small art museum with her as friends. No pressure or expectations attached. I said yes, and we met there on Saturday morning. The museum was quiet and small, just 3 rooms of paintings and sculptures. We walked slowly through the exhibits, stopping to look at pieces that caught our attention. B pointed out details in a landscape painting I never would have noticed. I made her laugh by comparing an abstract sculpture to a weird pasta shape. We spent almost 2 hours there just talking about what we saw, sharing opinions, disagreeing about which pieces we liked best. It was the first time we'd just enjoyed each other's company without the weight of our history crushing everything. No discussions about the accident or the coma or what we meant to each other. Just 2 people looking at art and talking about normal things. Halfway through the second room, the museum started filling up with a tour group. Suddenly there were 30 people crowding around the paintings, talking loudly, moving in close. The noise and bodies pressed in around me and my chest got tight. I felt my breathing speed up and my vision started going fuzzy at the edges. Panic built in my chest like something alive trying to claw its way out. I mumbled an excuse to B about needing the bathroom and walked as steadily as I could toward the exit. In the bathroom, I locked myself in a stall and forced myself to use the coping tools my therapist had taught me. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. I pressed my feet flat against the floor and named 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear. The panic didn't disappear, but it stopped growing. After 10 minutes, I could breathe normally again. I washed my face and went back out to find B. She looked worried, but didn't ask questions. We finished looking at the last room and then left. Outside the museum, B asked if I was okay. I told her about the panic attack and how I'd managed to calm myself down. She listened without trying to fix it or make it better, just acknowledging that it happened. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me clearly that she couldn't promise me a future she couldn't see yet. She needed to know I'd be okay even if we decided we were better as friends. Every part of me wanted to argue, to convince her that we belonged together, that I'd waited 15 years for this, but I forced myself to stop and just say I understood. I told her I was working on building a life that wasn't centered entirely on her. It hurt to say it, but it was also true. B nodded and we walked back to the parking lot in silence. That week, I enrolled in an online course about digital marketing. The technology had changed so much since I'd last worked that I barely recognized half the terms they used. The first few lessons were hard to focus on because my brain still got tired easily and the information felt overwhelming. But having a goal beyond physical therapy gave me something to work toward. I took notes and rewatched videos when I didn't understand something. It was slow going, but it felt good to be learning skills that might actually help me find work someday. I wasn't just recovering. I was building towards something. V had her own session with Jasmine that same week. She told Jasmine she'd decided she was open to trying to date me slowly and carefully, but she needed to figure out how to communicate that in a way that was honest about her fears and boundaries. She didn't want to rush in like she had with her ex-husband, making promises she couldn't keep, but she also didn't want to push me away completely when something real was growing between us. Jasmine helped her practice different ways of saying it until B felt confident she could get the words out without either giving me false hope or shutting everything down. They role-played scenarios where I might react with too much enthusiasm or too much disappointment, and Jasmine coached her on staying grounded in what she actually knew she could offer. When B and I met for coffee the next day, I brought up the idea of a structured dating plan before she could say anything. I suggested weekly check-ins about how we were both feeling, no labels or expectations for 3 months, and both of us staying accountable to our individual growth work. B's whole face relaxed. She looked relieved that I was thinking practically instead of just romantically. She said that sounded good, and then added her own requirements. We both had to stay in therapy. We needed to pace physical intimacy carefully, and we had to be completely transparent about doubts or concerns as they came up. I agreed to everything. We sat there for a minute looking at each other across the table, both of us aware we were making a formal agreement about something that used to feel natural and easy. Then B stuck out her hand for me to shake like we were closing a business deal. I laughed and shook her hand. She started laughing too. We both sat there giggling about how formal we were being, how strange it felt to structure something that used to just happen between us without thinking. But underneath the awkwardness, there was relief. We were trying. We were choosing each other carefully this time, with our eyes open and our expectations realistic. It wasn't the grand romantic gesture from 15 years ago. It was something quieter and more grounded, something that might actually last. 2 weeks later, Olivia helped me move into a supervised rehab apartment on the 3rd floor of a building designed for people like me. The place had a small kitchen, a bathroom with grab bars everywhere, and a bedroom that felt huge compared to my hospital space. A staff member named Rita checked in twice a day to make sure I was managing okay, and to help if I got stuck on something. The first morning alone, I stood in the kitchen staring at the stove like it was alien technology. I knew how to cook before the accident, but my hands shook when I tried to crack eggs into a pan. I burned them black the first try, set off the smoke alarm, and had to open all the windows while Rita came running up the stairs. She didn't make me feel stupid about it. She just showed me how to adjust the heat and stood nearby while I tried again. That night, I attempted to make pasta and managed to boil the water over, creating a mess on the stovetop that took 20 minutes to clean. By the end of the first week, I'd burned dinner twice, nearly cut my finger off chopping vegetables, and felt exhausted from just trying to feed myself. But I was learning. Every small task like folding laundry or washing dishes felt like a victory, because 3 months ago, I couldn't even stand up without help. Rita started leaving me alone for longer periods, checking in only once a day, and I felt proud that I was managing even when things went wrong. On Saturday, B invited me to meet some of her friends at a casual lunch spot downtown. She picked me up and we drove together, my stomach tight with nerves about meeting people from her current life. The restaurant had outdoor seating and 4 people were already there when we arrived. B introduced me as someone important to her, not explaining further, and they all smiled and made room at the table. A woman named Sarah worked with B and talked about their office drama. A guy named Jaden asked about my rehab progress without being weird about it. 2 other friends, Amy and Jordan, were a couple who'd known B since her marriage. They were kind and curious, but didn't push when I gave short answers about where I'd been for 15 years. I sat there eating a sandwich and listening to them talk about weekend plans, work frustrations, and a hiking trip they were planning. It hit me that this was B's real life now. These were her people, her routines, her world that existed completely separate from me. She wasn't asking them to make space for me or change anything. She was just inviting me to see this part of her life and letting me decide if I wanted to be part of it. The lunch lasted 2 hours, and I felt tired by the end from all the social interaction. But it was good tired. When B drove me back to my apartment, she asked how it went, and I told her it felt nice to be was included without pressure. The next week, Sarah invited both of us to a dinner party at her place. It was casual, just 8 people total, and I helped B carry a dish she'd made to contribute. We were sitting in Sarah's living room talking when the doorbell rang and Sarah answered it. A tall man in his 40s stood there holding a box, and I recognized him from photos B had shown me. Her ex-husband. He handed the box to Sarah, explaining he'd found some of her stuff in his garage from when they'd all been roommates years ago. Everyone got quiet and awkward for a second. B stood up and said hi, and they exchanged a brief hug that looked stiff, but not hostile. He glanced at me, and B introduced us without explaining who I was. We shook hands. He stayed for maybe 5 minutes making small talk about his new job before leaving. After he was gone, the tension in the room lifted, and conversation started flowing again. Later that night, when B drove me home, she brought it up without me asking. She said seeing him now felt different from she'd expected. There was no pain or anger or wondering what if. They'd both moved on completely and built separate lives, and that felt like real closure. She seemed lighter after saying it, like she'd been carrying some weight she didn't know was there until it was gone. A few days later, B and I sat on my apartment couch drinking tea when she got quiet. She stared at her mug for a while before speaking. She admitted she'd replayed the scene of me rejecting her at my apartment door thousands of times over the years. In her version, I'd said yes when she asked for a chance, and we'd figured everything out together instead of losing 15 years. She wondered constantly what would have happened if I'd handled my hurt differently, if she'd explained herself better, if either of us had been braver. I listened without interrupting, my chest aching at the pain in her voice. When she finished, I told her I'd done the same thing. I'd spent countless hours in the hospital replaying that moment, wishing I could go back and choose differently. But we were kids then, I said. We didn't know how to handle impossible situations or communicate when we were hurt. We were doing the best we could with what we understood at the time. B nodded and wiped her eyes. We sat there for a while in silence, and something heavy that had been sitting between us finally lifted. We couldn't change the past, but maybe we could forgive ourselves for not knowing better back then. That night after B left, I opened my laptop and started writing. I typed out the whole story from the beginning, starting with watching her moving truck from my window, the phone call with Nick, the drive to the airport, the crash, waking up 15 years later, everything that had happened since. It took me 3 hours and my hands cramped from typing, but I needed to get it all down. When I finished, I read through it once and then sent it to Nick in an email. I asked for his honest thoughts, not about me and B specifically, but about how I was handling everything. I wanted to know if he thought I was approaching this the right way, or if I was missing something obvious. I hit send before I could overthink it, and then went to bed. The next morning, Nick had responded with a long message. He said he was proud of how I was handling everything, that it couldn't be easy to wake up in a completely different world and have to rebuild from scratch. He told me he was happy with his own life now, had a good job and a girlfriend he was serious about, and he wanted the same kind of contentment for both me and B. He said we deserved to figure out what we wanted without guilt or pressure from the past. His warmth and support made my throat tight. I saved the email to read again later. When B came over that afternoon, I showed her what I'd sent Nick and his response. She read both carefully, her expression soft. When she looked up, she asked if I wanted to go on a real date with her. Not a hospital visit or a therapy-related hangout, but an actual date where we dressed up and tried to have fun like normal people. My heart started racing and I said yes immediately, probably too fast, but I didn't care. She smiled and said she'd planned something for the weekend. The next few days dragged by slowly, while I tried not to obsess over what to wear or what we'd talk about. Saturday morning arrived and B picked me up wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before. I'd borrowed a nicer shirt from my rehab friend and actually combed my hair. We drove to a coffee shop near a big park and ordered drinks, then walked along the paths talking about current things. She told me about a book she was reading and I told her about the online course I was taking. We discussed shows we'd both watched and what we wanted from the next year. The conversation flowed easily without either of us bringing up the past or the accident. At one point, our hands brushed, and I took hers carefully. She squeezed back, and we walked like that for a while. It felt both familiar, like something we'd done 1,000 times before, and completely new, like we were two different people learning each other fresh. We sat on a bench by a pond and watched ducks swim around. B leaned against my shoulder, and I felt more content than I had in months. Later that week, B had her regular session with Jasmine and told her about the date. She explained that something felt different this time. She wasn't falling into caretaker mode or trying to fix me. I was actually leading parts of the conversation and making decisions about where to walk. She felt like she was with an equal partner instead of someone she needed to rescue. Jasmine pointed out that this was what they'd been working toward, and B needed to notice and appreciate when the dynamic felt healthy instead of just worrying about when it might go wrong. B agreed and said she felt hopeful in a way that was grounded instead of desperate. My discharge day from the rehab facility arrived on a Thursday morning. Will came by my apartment one last time to do a final assessment and make sure I was ready. I walked the length of the apartment without assistance, made breakfast while he watched and answered all his questions about my outpatient therapy schedule. He signed the paperwork and shook my hand, telling me he was proud of my progress. Olivia stopped by an hour later with more forms for me to sign committing to ongoing therapy check-ins and monthly assessments. She reminded me this was a beginning, not an ending, and I needed to stay on top of my appointments. I thanked her for everything she'd done to help me navigate the system. After they left, I sat alone in my apartment feeling both excited and terrified about being truly independent. That evening, B came over with takeout and a small gift bag. Inside was a spare key to her apartment. She explained it was for safety and access, but not an invitation to move in. She wanted me to have it in case of emergency, or if I needed a place to go, but she was clear that we weren't ready to live together. I took the key carefully and told her I wasn't ready for that either. I needed to prove to myself I could manage alone first, that I could build a life that was mine before trying to merge it with someone else's. She looked relieved that I understood. We ate dinner together and talked about small things, and when she left, I put the key on my keychain next to my apartment key. It felt like a promise of something real and careful, something we were building slowly instead of rushing into. A week later, B picked me up and we drove to the intersection where the accident happened 15 years ago. Neither of us said much during the drive. I stared out the window watching familiar streets pass by, noticing how different everything looked now. She parked a block away and we walked the rest of the distance together. The intersection looked ordinary, just another corner with a traffic light and crosswalk. B had brought flowers from the grocery store, simple daisies wrapped in plastic. We stood on the sidewalk for a while, both of us quiet as we looked at the spot where my car had flipped and hit the light post. I placed the flowers carefully against the pole, my hands shaking a little. B reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. She said we didn't have to come back here again unless we wanted to, that this could be the last time if it helped us move forward. I nodded and we walked back to her car slowly, still holding hands. That evening, I helped B wash dishes in her kitchen after we'd ordered takeout for dinner. We stood side by side at the sink, her washing and me drying, falling into an easy rhythm. She handed me a plate and said she loved me. Just like that. No big speech or dramatic moment. I almost dropped the plate but managed to set it down safely on the counter. I told her I loved her too, my voice steady and sure. We both smiled at each other, knowing we were choosing this carefully instead of being swept away by old feelings or guilt about what happened years ago. 3 months passed, and my routine settled into something that felt real and lasting. I worked part-time from my apartment doing customer service for a small company, answering emails and taking calls a few hours each day. Therapy sessions happened twice a month now instead of weekly, and I kept up with my physical exercises on my own. Nick called me one evening for our regular video chat, and he looked genuinely happy, telling me about the woman he'd been dating for 2 months. She worked at his company and they'd met at a team lunch. He asked about me and B, and I told him we were taking things slow, but it felt right. He smiled and said he was glad for both of us, that we all deserved good things. Last Saturday, B and I hosted a small dinner at her apartment. Nick came with his new girlfriend and B invited 2 of her friends from work. My rehab friend showed up with a bottle of wine, walking without his cane now and doing much better. We crowded around B's small dining table with mismatched chairs and ate pasta she'd made. There was laughter and easy conversation, people sharing funny stories about their weeks and asking each other questions. No one made grand speeches about second chances or how far we'd all come. It was just people who cared about each other sharing a normal evening together, passing dishes and refilling glasses. When everyone left around 10, B and I cleaned up the kitchen together again, and that simple routine felt like more than enough.